This week, we welcome Greg Foss, Senior Threat Researcher at VMware Carbon Black's Threat Analyst Unit, to talk about the 2020 MITRE ATT&CK malware trends. In this week's security news, NSA warns of Russian-linked APT group is exploiting the exim flaw since 2019. Suspicious superhumans beyond rise in attacks on online services. Hackers compromise Cisco servers via the salt stack flaw. OpenSSH is going to deprecate SHA-1 logins due to a security risk. All that and more with special guest Ed Scotus will join us for the news segment, the founder of CounterHack and faculty fellow at the SANS Institute, talk about some free, that's right, free talks and hacking challenges that are happening for everyone, which is awesome. In our final segment, a pre-recorded interview with Peter Singer. He's a strategist at New America and the author of Burn-In, a novel of the real robotics revolution, talking about all things about his new novel, which I actually just started listening to today. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Are you an enterprise dissatisfied with overpriced analytics software that can't keep up with modern data? If so, then GravWell is the solution for you. GravWell is an unstructured data analytics platform for enterprises who demand total data visibility across their network. GravWell lets your security team go beyond the SIM and fuse data sources to correlate and answer questions you didn't know needed to be asked. Go to gravwell.io/securityweekly for an unlimited data trial and gain uncompromising visibility today. PlexTrack is the platform that guides the healthy collaboration of red and blue teams to get the daily security work done. Red teams can create reports in half the time and track risk to resolution with the blue team. Blue teams can centralize remediation efforts across all scans, assessments, and audits through simple visualizations of risk, scanner, and ticketing integrations. Enhanced analytics allow you to effectively communicate risk in real time. PlexTrack is perfect for remote collaboration across all teams. Visit securityweekly.com/PlexTrack to claim your free month today.
And welcome to the show. Yet another week of social distancing, but let me introduce you to a man who recompiles his kernel just because he can and sends creepy packages to Dave Kennedy on a regular basis. Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Welcome everyone to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 653, recorded on May 28th, 2020, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. At least that's where I am. The rest of the illustrious hosts are remote, practicing social distancing. Mr. Larry Pesce. Larry, welcome.
Hey, another weekend. Another week back at it. Yeah, I spent way too much time doing technology today. That was brain hurting.
Yes.
So
I was right there. You know, I was actually doing stuff with actual physical servers because we still have a lot of those here in the studio. And
I was doing stuff with SQLite 3 and JQ.
Yeah. Oh God. Good Lord. Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome.
I'm glad to be here. I remember the old days when we had physical servers. Oh my goodness, those were fun times. Now, actually there's use for them. So anyway, I'm glad to hear you're actually rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty.
Yes. HDMI sucks. Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us. Jeff, welcome.
I've started dreaming about being at random hacker conferences at a cigar bar with us, and dang it, I miss it.
I miss it too, Jeff. I do. Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
I miss you too, Jeff. A lot.
I miss you too, Tyler. And we still haven't talked yet.
Oh. Joff Fire is here with us. Joff, welcome. And he's on mute. It's awesome. He's talking.
We can't hear you.
He's like, oh, wait, I got to turn my mic pack on. Hold on.
Wait, I got to turn on my balls.
Okay, I'm back.
There he is.
Well, I was just telling a story. I raised my desk to a standing position a minute ago, and I forgot that I had a desktop plugged into a cable, which
Oh.
5 seconds ago was dangling.
Yes.
Hanging from the desk. So, yeah, it's a night. Anyway, good to be here.
Sounds like a personal problem.
Well, see, that's one reason why I like DisplayPort better than HDMI, because DisplayPort, you could like hold your server by the DisplayPort cable and it would be fine, right?
I'll send you guys a photo. I took a photo of it.
That's awesome.
It was great.
Put it up on the Discord channel.
Speaking of virtual conferences and ones that we will not be able to get together and have cigars at, join us at InfoSec World virtually June 22nd through the 24th. Security Weekly listeners will save 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass by visiting securityweekly.com/ISW 2020. Click the register button to register with our discount code. No stranger to the show. And a very good friend of the show for some time, Greg has made his presence known visiting our booth at conferences for several years. And Greg Foss is now a senior threat researcher with VMware Carbon Black's Threat Analyst Unit, where he focuses on detection, engineering, security efficacy, and bypasses across the diverse product lines. There's a lot of big words in there, Greg. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me. Great to see you all.
Yes, nice to have you here with us this evening. Greg, I think that the project that you're working on or have worked on at VMware Carbon Black is super interesting. So I will turn it over to you to kind of set the stage and give us some background and information about this project.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks, Paul. So essentially what I wanted to talk with you all about and essentially get your thoughts around is essentially a report that we put together covering all of the different types of malware that we saw over 2019. And what was interesting about it is we really wanted to look at, how MITRE ATT&CK can play into, classifying and analyzing and understanding, the behaviors of malware. What are the common trends that we're seeing? What are the unique activities malware is performing? And then what are the overlaps? What are the commonalities we see across all types of malware families that we've analyzed? And
so, Greg, just to set the stage, I have a couple of questions. So in 2019, how many different, it's kind of a loaded question, right? How many different pieces of malware did VMware Carbon Black catalog in 2019?
Yeah, so in total, that's up there in the millions if you're looking at all of the different minute kind of pieces of malware.
Right.
For this report, what we really wanted to do was narrow that scope down and focus on unique malware variants, not getting tons of different repackaged kind of samples to run through and get the same results.
Yeah, you get into the millions if it's like every variant of every piece of malware, right?
Exactly. So we ended up, for this report, we specifically chose 2,000 samples that were still active and still had various capabilities that were able to actively dynamically detonate and statically analyze to a point where we could get some useful data without having to really go through and reverse everything.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why we whittled it down to that. 2,000
pieces of unique malware is a really good sample, right? Provided those are all 2,000 different unique families and have some characteristics that can be analyzed and measured, that's a really good sampling, no? Does the other folks agree? Yeah, I agree. I think it's good.
Yeah, and the trickiest part of this whole project was actually just getting to that point of, whittling these down and getting to a point where we had a sample set that we felt was adequate to cover a large range of behavioral analytics. And then also, not overloading it too much, not getting too much overlap. We really wanted to keep things as unique as possible, in terms of the different malware families and C2s.
And now, Greg, these 2,000 pieces of malware, you analyzed the malware's behavior. Did that include how it might have originally landed on the box, so the initial exploit, or was that kind of off the table? We're just looking at the behavior once the malware lands on the system.
Correct. So that was the tricky part. We couldn't really look at how the malware got onto the system. Well, what we were most interested in was
people don't know
the behaviors afterwards. Yeah. Most people don't know, and a lot of it, we pulled it from our sample set, so we actually couldn't really tell unless we did a lot of digging through the log data to really understand how they got there in the first place.
Right.
So we're really looking at that post-exploitation activity.
That's awesome. No, well, that's I think a very cool kind of scope. What does malware do once it lands on a system from a really good sample set?
And what was cool about this, and one of my old coworkers who actually came over to Carbon Black before I came over here from the Logarithm days, who you might have met as well, Andrew Costas.
Yeah,
he actually came up with this really cool idea for how to go through and dynamically analyze a large set of samples. And he put together a write-up on this on the Carbon Black blog, which basically talks about his kind of pipeline. And what he did was he took all of this data specifically focused on ransomware families. And we loved the work that he did around like basically analyzing these samples and then visually mapping the behavioral characteristics using Neo4j. So we could see, they're using defense evasion here, they're using it here and here and here. What's the overlap with all these families? How many families are using packed, are packing their code to make it harder for us and to bypass our defenses and things like that? So what we really wanted to do was extend upon Andrew's research and look at the larger sample set, look at info stealers, look at banking Trojans, really expand this past looking at just ransomware. Because that's a big trend we're seeing now is ransomware being reused and repurposed in a lot of different ways. Some of the scarier stuff is like the specific wipers and stuff that have come out of just people modifying ransomware samples and things of that nature. So we really wanted to try and understand the larger scope.
It's software. It's malware is software, right? And if you think about how we use software, we reuse open source components all the time as security professionals. When you're developing software for outside of security, right? You're reusing open source components, and malware authors do the same thing.
Exactly. And it makes it a lot easier. You can extend your malware. Like a lot of the ransomware we're seeing that's been turned into wipers. They're adding stuff like mapping out SMB shares so they can pivot and wipe systems and move laterally and things like that. Even when the original ransomware it was derived from didn't perform any of those activities. So a lot of interesting stuff really came out of this data, especially extrapolating it out and then laying all of this across the MITRE ATT&CK framework to really make sense of it and make it in a format that we could actually, put in a report and have it actually be something that could resonate with people.
So, Greg, and I'm sure this is the question on everyone's mind. So you have 2,000 samples, you've analyzed what the malware did, and you've mapped that to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. What were some of the most popular techniques across these malware samples in terms of behavior?
Yeah, definitely. Like the number one that we saw across all of these was defense evasion techniques. Pretty much all of the samples that we assessed were packed in some way, especially to get around our software and any other endpoint protection software. A lot of them leveraged hidden windows. They would pop up PowerShell or something like that, but they do it using hidden windows in order to obfuscate or hide, kind of mask what they were doing. But those two techniques and just defense evasion in general was something we saw consistently across just about every single sample that we ran through.
That's because I think if you truly want to be evasive in malware, there's a lot of engineering that goes into that, and probably a step that common everyday malware doesn't go through. They're just borrowing from other people's evasion techniques.
Exactly. Well, now, with endpoint technology advancing at the rate that it is, we're starting to hook into really cool things like Microsoft's anti-malware scan interface, which allows us to see a lot of the really cool inner workings of what malware is doing in memory. One of my favorite things with that is we're able to get the raw shell code back out of the logs. If someone has performed this attack and, they've obfuscated, they've done all these kind of things to get around our defenses, we still have this raw log data that we can trigger off of using AMSI that gives us just the full details of like, here's the original encoded content, here's what it comes out to as decoded, here's what's actually executing in memory. And then you can take that back and actually figure out, what was the impact of this attack. As endpoint technology is improving and in just general capabilities across the board, malware authors know that, they have to do these core fundamental things to get around it in order to accomplish their next objective.
Tyler, Joff, Larry seem to be in agreement. I don't see anyone cringing or wanting to call BS. So
I'm curious what the analytics or telemetry kind of looks like. Is there any kind of that seems like an awful lot of data to be pushing back all that AMSI and then the telemetry data with inside of the core AMSI stuff. Really, really helpful and pretty cool. But how does that get kind of sanitized and parsed, and how do you guys deal with that level of data?
That's an excellent question, because AMSI, if you're just collecting everything, you can get a lot of sensitive data with that as well. So, any document you open or something like that, especially if it has macros embedded within it, that will trigger AMSI detections and analyze that data and generate a log file. So one of the things we do, we actually control on our agent essentially which data we're going to keep locally and then which data we're going to push up to our cloud for analysis. And then basically, that's going to be available to the customer through our web interface. But the interesting thing there is we had to make a lot of decisions around, what data should we choose to send up? What data should we choose to send down or to leave on the endpoint? We also chose to leave everything in the raw log on the endpoint in case, end users want to push this data to their SIM. They want to centrally log this. They want to have that available to them for instant response and things of that nature. We wanted to leave that data available to them, but we also didn't want to be responsible for more than we have to in order to do the base detections for these types of attacks. So we do a lot of filtering just directly on the agent in terms of what we're going to leave there and what we're actually going to analyze. So a lot of that is tricky because malware authors know this. There's tons of work around AMSI bypasses and things of that nature in general. Which funny enough for us, those actually become indicators in and of themselves. So if someone's trying to unhook AMSI, we generate a log of that and we purposefully do trigger on that activity. That's an indicator in and of itself that we want to know about and we want our customers to be aware of. So a lot of it really comes down to, figuring out from the get-go, what is the actionable data that we actually need to perform a high fidelity detection of this activity? And then, how do we get that up and process it and make sure that we have rules that are actually actively taking advantage of that data up in our cloud storage as well?
Lee.
So, you're working on your response and detection stuff. I want to say this nicely. What's your assessment of the humans behind the screen that you're trying to service? Where are they at? Are there gaps there as well? And you really got to raise the bar for them, or you just got to give them a little extra nudge to get them that last little bit?
Yeah, it really depends on the user, right? We have users that run the whole gamut. Some of our customers, they throw us through the ringer when we go meet with them, and they've figured out all these real cool things. It's really interesting going and just talking to some customers and seeing what they've done within their environment. A lot of that is how we actually developed some of our cooler detections. We're just seeing these really unique attack scenarios, just with talking with customers and figuring out, due to their unique business, what are some of the unique threats that are impacting them? And then we have to take that back to our labs and basically simulate that and figure out, how can we create a reliable indicator for this, but also not light up everyone's consoles with false positives so that they turn off this feed. It's that kind of constant balance of making sure we provide enough information that they can get to those points on their own, and making sure that as we develop these rules, if we can make them as high fidelity as possible, like if it's something we can put in our advanced threats watch list, which is one people are more often going to enable for actively alerting on and responding to, we'll aim to do that versus, some of our lower fidelity watch lists that are more for aggregating the data and maybe offloading it to a SIM or something like that.
Interesting. Do you, as you're working with customers and you're getting some of those specific indicators, are you finding much reuse, or are they really pretty targeted now? I think we've matured as an industry, but I don't know how far.
Usually a lot of reuse. So one of the things we do is we'll actually run these queries across a large sample set of customers who've opted in, basically where we can see, what is the real world efficacy of this rule? Like if we push this out, is this going to trigger when people are running their configuration management software and it's running encoded PowerShell commands across hosts on their environment and stuff like that? We do a lot of work in not just building these detections, but making sure that we can accurately tune out the false positives, because we want them to be as actionable as possible for people. And that was a big goal for
Greg,
this project.
it sounds very similar to when I used to work in vulnerability management, right? You have to play the same game of, I want to detect this all the time, but if I make this rule so that it detects it more often than not, a lot more people are going to get false positives. And if I tune it in the opposite direction, some people are going to get false negatives. And I think that, many folks out there looking at vendor solutions don't appreciate how difficult that is in any given scenario.
Right. And that's one of the things, like, I'm glad you mentioned vuln management, because that's why, one of the things we've added recently to the product is called LiveOps, which is basically a wrapper for OS query. Mm-hmm. So one of the things my team works on is writing these queries to go out and figure out, patch levels of systems and stuff like that. It's not near the level of actual vulnerability management, but it's light enough that it gives me an appreciation for what you were doing with Tenable and how challenging that is. It's a whole different beast. Detection engineering, vulnerability management. There's so much minute details that go into these things. Definitely gives you a new perspective on it, dealing with it directly.
Greg, when you were working with this data from the malware samples, how much of it relied on a vulnerability versus some kind of configuration or just living off the land? It's my assessment that most malware today is living off the land, not necessarily exploiting vulnerabilities.
Agreed. Yeah. Majority of what we saw is all living off the land components. One of the really neat things we saw is just this automated pivoting and lateral movement. Doing a lot of more unique kind of methods of moving around the network and trying to target adjacent systems and things of that nature, especially with ransomware. One of the things we saw is they're getting a lot more effective with it and figuring out how they can actually map out and find backups and things like that before actually implementing encryption, just on their initial target host.
Jeff.
So many questions, and fair warning, Greg, I've been doing a lot of research on the MITRE ATT&CK framework for the last month or two, so I know enough about it to be dangerous, probably. I'm sort of looking at it from a different perspective, I think, and so I want to walk through something. Bear with me a second. I'm looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework primarily from, okay, there's all these different attack techniques that are out there that are real world, and this is why you should care about them, because it's real. It's not hypothetical like the 50 million vulnerabilities that people are fed up with having to deal with, which makes sense. I look at it in the perspective of there's 40 mitigations that the attack framework highlights is here's how you fix all these problems. And for what we're talking about tonight, the mitigation that is at hand, if you will, is antivirus, anti-malware. I believe that's where you fit. Your what you guys do fit in terms of the mitigation category, at least based on looking at the reports you published and some of the techniques and tactics that you highlighted. So I guess to finally get around to a question, if I'm an organization and I'm trying to protect myself against the world and basing it on a MITRE ATT&CK framework, and I get to the category of antivirus, anti-malware, it seems like the solution is I should get your product. Is that a fair conclusion?
If you ask our salespeople, that's definitely what they'll tell you. But no, really, I mean, it comes down to a holistic approach. A lot of this, sure, could be blocked at the endpoint, based on just anti-malware, antivirus, just blocking the bad stuff, right? And that is kind of the downside, I would say, of this research and the way we looked into this, because we were only looking at malware. So we weren't looking at those behavioral characteristics of, say, like an insider or something like that. Where like the realm I play in mostly within Carbon Black is on the EDR side. So we're mostly focused on just the detection side. We want to be able to prove what happened. Say you have to go and something goes to litigation or you need to do an investigation. We want to be able to give you the evidence to prove kind of what happened, and hopefully the proactive alerting to know about it before it happens. The prevention side is one where mostly what we do is figure out how to get around defenses and stuff like that. So it's fun in one part until we have to go and fixing those things. So I always look at this like, it's not a silver bullet. We're not going to install our product and it's going to block everything. You have to look at, having those layers across your organization. It's really defense in depth is the only thing that's really going to, actually protect your organization. Because there's so many different attack vectors, so many different ways they can get in. It's not always going to be a phishing email with malware being dropped. One of the things we're seeing more commonly now is public-facing Linux servers just being attacked directly. I believe the NSA report today came out was an example of that, the EXIM mail server. So it's always going to come back to just like having those layers, making sure that you have that segmentation in your network. That's the biggest thing that's going to help for these ransomware attacks and things like that, where they're going to try and pivot, find your backups, encrypt those, and then start moving back through the rest of the organization. But if you can stop that initial pivot, that will actually stop a majority of some of these more pervasive ransomware samples. That's why in the report, you'll notice not all of these had data encrypted for impact as an actual detector for the ransomware category. And that was because they were still actively looking for shares. And our detonation, we were doing this just on a single host. So it actually didn't get to that point to do the full encryption process until we actually did this in a lab that simulated the enterprise environment.
So a follow-up question, and I think you've sort of alluded to it a little bit, and it may end up being more of a prevention discussion than a detection discussion. But I'm curious, in your research looking at malware, are there the simple question is, what is the purpose, the underlying purpose or theme of the malware? But more specifically, do you find that the malware that you guys investigate sort of fall into sort of different buckets or categories? Is the malware the end game, or is the malware a means to another end? And what's interesting about the MITRE ATT&CK framework is I think that there's the potential for threading the use of malware back to many different techniques, if not several, I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong or weigh in, several of the 12 tactics that they've identified. Tactics being in the MITRE ATT&CK framework sort of the overall goals of the attacker, or categories of where the attacks fall. Does that question make sense? Do you categorize the malware that you look at, and do they fall into sort of identifiable buckets, and then do you have to address them in different particular ways, and how much does that then play into prevention?
Yeah. Do you have like a bucket for North Korea, a bucket for China, a bucket for Russia?
Well, no. So that's a good question. We do bucket in certain ways, mostly by characteristics and behavior. If we can find like the malware family, or we think we know the malware authors. We don't do a whole lot in the attribution game, just because it's so fuzzy, right? There's so many ways that they can mask, what their true intentions are, or who the actual authors are, or things of that nature. So what we mostly focus on is just looking at the behaviors, understanding, how we can classify these in terms of the malware families based on their behaviors. So we look at those top level kind of behaviors. What is the main goal of this piece of malware, and then that helps us kind of bucket it. Now, when you have the ones that are publicly named and documented and things like that, which most samples are today, makes it a lot easier, because then we can logically group those in a way that makes sense to others in the industry that do kind of the same work. And then it makes it transferable, so we can share that data with them, and it's going to make sense when we share data, and they don't have to pick it apart and be like, oh, what is this grouping here and things like that. But a second part to your question that I think is even more interesting is we do see specific verticals that are targeted in the same way and by the same types of attacks. So one of the things we pulled out in terms of ransomware specifically, their main target all throughout 2019 was energy and utilities. And it wasn't just ransomware, that was for wipers as well, which is kind of scary, looking at this destructive malware that's primarily targeting energy and utilities. That was one of the more eye-opening kind of metrics that we were able to pull out of this that I think was kind of concerning, to be honest.
It's funny. Well, John Strand's he called it out on ESW this week. He's not a huge fan of, hey, in this industry, people are hacking systems in this way, so therefore that's what we should defend against. And I mean, and I tried to balance that off. In my opinion, it is a data point. I think that people take that too far to an extreme and design their entire program around, well, our partners and competitors in this space are being targeted in this way, so therefore that shapes and defines our entire security program, right? I think it's a data point. You can't ignore those things, but it shouldn't shape your entire program.
It's funny that you bring that up, Paul. I was actually talking to Josh Corman yesterday because we were doing our prep call because we're going to bring him on Security and Compliance Weekly next Tuesday, June 2nd.
Nice.
It's my shameless plug. But he brought up several times the notion of the 80-20 rule, and I think and we don't seem to talk about that a lot these days. I mean, that was one of the big things that we talked about 20 years ago with sort of the beginning of this whole internet cybersecurity thing. But it kind of makes sense pragmatically for companies to try to protect themselves against the things that are commonly targeting against them within an industry. Not saying that they're totally protected, but it sort of plays into the notion of 80-20 and or sometimes we refer to it the low-hanging fruit. So I think to some degree it makes sense. I had sort of a follow-up question, and then I'll shut up for Greg, is, or anybody can answer this because, I'm an old timer. In the early days, we talked about viruses, we talked about Trojans, we talked about worms, so we sort of had distinctive names for, I think, what loosely or collectively was called malware. Is what we call malware today significantly different? Are there, sort of back to the bucket question, are there, wiping is certainly probably one category of malware, but does the malware today kind of do the same things that we used to talk to in terms of viruses and Trojans and worms and things like that? And are they covered, and how much more new is there?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think in general, malware still has the same end goals, right? They want to have code execution on the system. They want to perform either a specific subset of tasks or open the door so that, more, someone can come in and actually access the system remotely. I think at the end of the day, it's still kind of all the same sort of stuff. It's just maybe a different means to an end.
Right. That would be a rat. That would be a rat, I think, is what, Greg, you were just describing, right?
Yeah.
And I tend to, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt Greg, but because Greg brought up a great point that there's yet another kind of classification, right, in remote access Trojan or remote access capabilities, coupled with the capability to wipe, in all these other things, and spread, which is a worm. And when I use the term malware, I think of it as malicious software that could have any one or all of those different components within it, right? So you may have that software that does spread like a worm, that's part of the malware, right? Does have that remote access capability. It could have the capability to wipe. Better yet, it's a loader that can really load any kind of functionality to accomplish goals, which is often the way slightly more sophisticated malware operates. Tyler?
I would also add to that, like what you're talking about there are different functionalities and levels of sophistication. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, a lot of the viruses and old school malware, for lack of a better term, has some of the similarities. What we're really dealing with, and as malware writers, we're typically dealing with the level of sophistication, our ability to do C2 and comms, and our ability to blend in and evade. And so you're really talking about most of the same functions, which at the end of the day, we're all there to kind of accomplish a goal, gain access to IP, compromise a system, do something on that system or network. The functionality in which you do that, the level of sophistication, and how you go about doing that is where a lot of the differentiators starts to come into play, and how or why we have to differentiate because of each complexity level that you have to dive into as you're writing or operating or using these tools.
I have a question.
Yes. Hey, Joff.
How's everybody going? So I've been sitting back and listening.
How's it hanging, Joff?
Yeah, it's totally face planted right now. But that's the PC that I dangled from the desk earlier. My question is this: it's kind of targeted. How has so mid 2019 .NET 4.8 they started pushing assemblies through the AMSI interface, assembly loads. How's that changed your workload and how you guys are approaching things now?
No, that's a great question. So the nice thing about that is now people can actually leverage those detections. Before, like a lot of the issue with AMSI in general is a lot of people don't have the correct versions to get the data into the AMSI log. So if you don't have .NET version, the latest version of .NET,
right.
You're actually not gonna be able to collect any of that data by default. You're also not going to be able to hook into as many processes in order to see that data. And so that's why we saw for a long time, and actually pretty much every endpoint vendor in the space was affected by this, was the ability to use .NET malware to get around basically everything. Like, it is amazing how easy it was to leverage stuff like a Covenant, to just shovel shells out and do your post-exploitation, stuff like that. And also unhook AMSI just as a safeguard. So tools like that had so much capability that really pushed us to go back to our engineering teams and figure out, what else can we do here? So the other thing we're looking into now is looking into event tracing for Windows. Trying to hook in there in addition to AMSI, so we can get kind of all of these unique components. And ETW is a key component for collecting that AMSI data, and especially looking at, or not AMSI data, the .NET data, so that we can actually correctly identify that activity and write better rules around that activity. So it's just a constantly kind of evolving cat and mouse game, so to speak.
Do you have a detection on the street now already for some of the .NET assemblies that are being loaded?
Oh, not yet. No. We have some stuff, like if you do the AMSI integration, we can look at some certain things. Like one of the funny things within Covenant specifically is usually there's an error code thrown every time communications are sent up and down. So that's actually one of the little indicators that we can look at in order to figure out, is this an event that we want to branch off and look at in more detail as this activity is continuing. Not necessarily something we can alert on directly because it's not high fidelity, but it's something that can give us a leading indicator that we might be able to leverage in more detail later.
And a follow-on question to that, do you see reversing assemblies back to source code form as part of the detection strategy eventually?
Definitely going to have to get there, I think. That's the tricky part. I mean, we saw, not the same sort of attack, but just, was it a week or two ago, there was an attack that was actually loading a whole virtual machine in order to just evade endpoint detections to get around, our traditional looking into these binaries as they were in order to actually encrypt the host. So they're definitely getting creative, and I think that local compilation and stuff like that is something to definitely look into in more detail for sure.
Awesome, thanks. I'm very interested in this area, and I'm kind of active in this area as a red teamer, so it's fascinating to talk to you.
Wait,
you
hold
know
on.
Your stuff, man.
Describe the local compilation, because I think that's really interesting.
Oh.
How how does that work on a Windows? How does that work on a Windows environment? The local compilation. I basically just download. Sorry, are you there, Greg?
Yeah, I'm back now.
Oh, okay. So I mean, basically, local compilation is I load my source code on the host, and then I use local tools to compile it, and I can evade detection. Or am I oversimplifying it?
No, that's pretty much it. The hard part is you'd have to target a host that has those tools installed and things like that. Linux is an area where we'll see that more commonly than say a Windows target. But yeah, it's definitely one of the ways people will try and evade our detections for sure.
Yeah, on Linux, I like to rely on whatever already exists on the Linux host, because okay, so they don't have Git or wget installed, and maybe they don't even have GCC installed, but there's Python or PHP or even just Bash scripting, right? And I think Linux is certainly a riper target for malware than Windows is in that respect.
And that's one of the things, like, focusing on the post-exploitation activity specifically has been a key area for us to, try and stay ahead of a lot of these new techniques. Because at the end of the day, if you say you get a shell on a host, you're going to want to have a TTY, you're going to want to have a more interactive session. So we look for those kind of indicators. So maybe we miss the initial exploit, we're still going to catch the other activities at some point. That's our thing, is to have enough of these bells and whistles kind of just throughout the whole enterprise that it's going to be difficult to not trip some of those if you're up to no good in that network.
Well, it's certainly frustrating to go back to one of your earlier points, Greg, about if enterprises are running more recent versions of Windows and or .NET and the various components, you can do a better job of detecting stuff, right? But least common, I think, was in the chat, like upgrades. Who upgrades, right?
Yeah, just to dovetail on that for a minute, Paul. It's the same thing with what red teamers and pen testers have been doing with PowerShell downgrade attacks for a long time. If we can just run version 2, then screw all that instrumentation and just walk around it. And I think the same thing is going to emerge with .NET assemblies as well. Although subject to verification, of course.
Completely agree.
Jeff. Sorry,
that's
Greg.
The thing that scares us now. And in the endpoint industry, anything .NET, you come to any EDR vendor, we will be a little worried about it.
Yeah, because I think the false positive, because there are legitimate uses for .NET, and from my talking with endpoint vendors, that gets a little dicey.
Does.
Jeff.
So I would be remiss if we had Greg on representing Carbon Black, and I didn't ask a PCI question or two.
Sure.
Oh shit! Drink.
And admittedly, my experience with Carbon Black is probably a little bit dated, but when Carbon Black came on the scene for my PCI customers, they were very excited about the prospect of using Carbon Black as a compensating control for several requirements. And I just want to rattle them off very quickly, Greg, and you just say, yep, we do that, or yeah, we're still doing that, or not so much these days. I think primarily, obviously, the antivirus, anti-malware requirement in PCI, I think you would still say Carbon Black is a viable option.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. It was also promoted for an alternative or compensating control for being able to patch endpoints or patch endpoints consistently under the premise that Carbon Black was taking a snapshot and essentially whitelisting and there would be no way to introduce something or exploit something that's out there because Carbon Black wouldn't let you do that. Still making that claim, Carbon Black, or not so much?
Yeah, correct. So that's Carbon Black Protect, which is essentially our application whitelisting tool. And so that is basically, anything that is not pre-approved is not going to be able to execute on that host.
I think we used to call that Bit9, but
Yep, exactly. That. Yes. So that's the original.
Well, yeah, but Bit9 was absorbed by Carbon Black,
correct.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, and fully integrated. Yeah.
Yeah, so Bit9 bought Carbon Black, the EDR company, and then they took the Carbon Black name, and then Carbon Black bought Confer, and then now it's all kind of under one umbrella. Yeah. So we have like the on-prem component still, which is where Protect falls into the Bit9 component. And that's key. We want to keep that on-prem because especially like PCI environments, if you want to have this in a segmented environment that's not, touching the internet and stuff like that, we want to be able to provide that. We also have the on-prem EDR component for those same reasons as well still.
The other requirement that Bit9 Carbon Black was presented as a compensating control was for file integrity monitoring. Assume that you guys still kind of cover that space as well.
Yeah, definitely. We do full file integrity monitoring. Yep.
Okay. Great. Thank you. That was easy.
You had good questions.
So, Greg, we mentioned the report in the project that you worked on where you looked at the malware samples, mapped those to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. There's a lot of other interesting data points in that report. I believe we have a link in the show notes. Yes, we do.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Link to that is in the show notes. Any other thoughts or comments, Greg, on the report that is, in fact, linked in the show notes?
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for sharing that out there and having me on to talk about it. Definitely something, I recommend people take a look at and see if it actually helps you, refine areas that you should focus on within your defensive posture within your organization. One of the key takeaways we wanted to generate from this, and I think we're still working on refining this process and maybe, making it improving it for the next go around of this. But essentially what we want to do is reduce our false positives, give people meaningful items to look at. Here are the top kind of most commonly attributed MITRE ATT&CK techniques that are being leveraged. Here are some examples of these, and here are some tools to help you go and hunt for these. Whether it's using our software or something else, we're more open to just getting that information out there and helping people defend their organizations, but also not be inundated with a mountain of alerts at the same time. So that's kind of our whole end goal and spiel with this report.
Yeah, I think it's presents some great data points for folks to look at and compare with what you are doing or not doing in your environments today with respects to security.
Definitely.
Fantastic. Greg, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly. It was wonderful catching up with you. Again, folks can get the report in the show notes. And again, thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Greg.
So
good seeing you.
Thanks, Greg.
Great
Good to meet you.
With that, we'll take a short break, come back. We're going to do a kind of a mini interview with Ed Scotus, and Ed's going to stick around while we talk about the security news, so stay tuned.